The Walking Dead audio comic is presented in episodic format. If this is the first episode you are listening to, please go back to episode 1 and begin from there. The following podcast is for mature audiences only. Listener discretion is advised.
Previously on The Walking Dead audio comic. Rick Grimes makes his way into Atlanta on horseback after having run out of gas, only to find it abandoned and falling apart. As he moves slowly through the city, a mob of creatures surrounds him and the horse, pulling the horse down, leaving Rick vulnerable. After killing a few of the creatures, he finds an escape route down an alley where he is stopped by a young Asian man who helps him to get away. The two men make their way across rooftops and into another alley, heading for the relative safety of a nearby forest and camp some survivors had set up. As they enter the forest, the young man explains that the creatures were the people who lived in Atlanta or had made their way there. Rick tells him that he thinks his wife and son made their way to Atlanta and fears that they are dead. The two continue on towards the camp, and to Rick's surprise, as they reach it, his wife and son run out to meet him. And now, issue 3 of The Walking Dead audio comic. Still holding tight to his family, a relieved look on his face, Rick muttered, I was so worried about you," as a man wearing a leather jacket with faux fur collar and a baseball cap approached him. The man placed his hand on Rick's shoulder, and with a smile starting to come to his lips said, "It's good to see you, man." Rick looked up from his embrace, and with a huge wave of excitement, a giant smile came to his face as he exclaimed, "Oh my God, Shane!" As Rick's wife let go of him, she wiped the tears of joy from her eyes and said, "Shane helped us get here. We wouldn't have made it without him." As Rick's wife, son, and others from the camp looked on, Rick put both his hands on Shane's shoulders and said, "Guess I owe you more than I'll ever be able to repay." Shane looked him dead in the eyes and replied, "Rick, please, it was nothing. I had to make up for letting you get shot like that." "Man, that wasn't your fault," Rick said, interrupting Shane. "Besides, I'm fine now." "Fair enough," Shane replied as he started to make his way towards the camp. "Let me show you around." As Shane took Rick towards the camp, a heavy-set bearded man wearing a flannel shirt crouched down beside the young Asian man who was opening his backpack and removing supplies. "What'd you get this time, Glenn?" the bearded man said, a big smile coming across his face as he watched the young man unpack. "I got some candy bars for the kids, some soap detergent, a couple of rolls of toilet paper," Glenn replied, looking at the man as he pulled out a roll of toilet paper from his backpack. The two men continued to check out the supplies Glenn brought from his run as Rick and Shane walked by. "You've met Glenn," Shane said to Rick as he tipped his cap towards them. "That's Alan hounding him for supplies. Alan's wife, Donna, is around here somewhere. They've got twins, Billy and Ben. They're hellions." As he got closer to the cars and camper where the main camp was set up, Rick could see a middle-aged woman sitting inside the back of a station wagon with a young girl next to her. On top of the camper was an older man with a rifle and a fishing hat on his head, and sitting on the steps leading into the camper was another man, middle-aged with a mustache, eating something from a spoon and wearing a baseball cap. "That's Dale up there keeping watch," Shane said as he continued to introduce the group to Rick. "That's his camper. Jim is over there eating." Shane then pointed towards the station wagon. "That's Carol and her daughter Sophia sitting on the back of the car." Rick and Shane made their way to the side of the camper where Jim sat eating. The door to the camper opened and two young blonde women made their way out. One wearing shorts and a hooded sweatshirt with the number 15 on it, her hair in a ponytail. The other was wearing a collared shirt underneath a sweater, her blonde parted hair flowing over her shoulders. Shane looked over at the two women and said, This is Amy and Andrea. They're sisters. You guys seen Donna and the twins? Just as Shane finished his sentence, a short-haired older woman wearing an American flag shirt and windbreaker came from around the front of the camper, 2 young boys alongside her.
We're right here. What? Oh, new arrival?
Donna said as she waved to Shane. Shane looked at Donna as she approached him and said, "This is Laurie's husband." Donna placed her hand on her chest and smiled as she looked at Rick and Laurie.
My word, that's the best news I've heard all month. Shane, darling, come with me. These two have got some catching up to do.
Donna reached out and took Shane's arm and started to lead him away from the camper. "Yeah," Shane said as he and Donna walked away. As they did, Donna gave a look back at Rick and Laurie, who were standing by a tent just holding on to one another, and smiled. As night came, everyone retired to their tents or cars as Shane kept a careful watch over the camp atop the RV. Rick sat by a roaring fire, staring at his hand, his wedding ring back where it belonged. Laurie popped her head out of the tent directly behind Rick as he continued to stare at the band of gold on his finger. "So glad you saved this for me," he said, a slight smile on his face, his eyes intently focused on his hand. "I felt naked without it. Is he asleep?" Laurie looked over at Rick and replied,
Yeah, finally.
She made her way out of the tent and sat down on the log next to Rick.
He can't sleep anymore unless he knows I'm right next to him. Never really had to slip away from him like that. I usually just lie there and look at him. He's...
Rick cut her off before she could finish her sentence.
You've been through a lot.
Laurie frowned as she continued to focus on her husband, while he started to remove the bandage from his right hand.
Yeah, I'm sorry we left you, Rick.
Rick reached out and put his arm around Laurie to comfort her.
Laurie, please, I understand the circumstances,
Rick said as he took Laurie's hand.
You thought Atlanta would be safer for Carl. I would have done the same thing.
Laurie sat staring at the fire and replied,
They said people were going to stay at the hospital when they evacuated us. From what you told me, they must have abandoned the hospital less than a week after we left.
Rick turned his head slightly to look at his wife, her head now on his shoulder.
You did what's right for little Carl. I'm just glad Shane was around to help you get here.
Rick continued to unwrap the bandage from his hand as Laurie looked on.
I don't even think I would have found the way down here without him, she said, let alone survived after we got here.
As Rick removed the rest of the bandage, a shocked look came over Laurie's face.
Your hand!
She exclaimed as she saw the puncture wound that was underneath. Rick grabbed his injured hand and looked down at it.
That's just from the IV, he reassured her. Not a big deal. Oh,
Laurie replied softly.
Is he enough up there?
Rick asked Laurie as he gestured over toward Shane with his thumb.
So far, that's all we've needed. Luckily, those things haven't come at us in any number. Most we've had at one time is 3.
Laurie replied as her face turned solemn.
Thing is, none of us really sleep anymore. Soon as we hear one of the shots, we're up ready to defend this place. We've only got 2 guns, Shane's pistol and Dale's rifle, but we've got shovels around the camp that we can hit them with. It's worked so far. They don't come very often.
Laurie placed her head back onto Rick's shoulder as he sat there with one arm lying across his knee. Suddenly she sat up and looked over at Rick, concerned.
Rick, you're shaking.
A distressed look fell across Rick's face as he thought back at everything he had faced.
Past 2 days. I've been so worried about finding you and Carl, getting here in one piece. I haven't had time to be scared.
Tired from the excitement of the day, Rick and Laurie retired to their tent where Carl was fast asleep inside. They laid down on either side of him and quickly dozed off. As they slept, nightmares crept into Rick's head of everything he had faced, and his expression turned to one of anger. The nightmare eventually woke him. As he opened his eyes, he sat up and looked over at his family who lay next to him, smiled, and placed his hand gently on Laurie's face. He was glad to have them back right by his side, safe. The next morning, Rick and Laurie awoke, the sun shining bright through the fabric of their tent. Rick opened the flap and looked around, while Laurie rubbed her eyes to get the sleep out. Rick stepped outside the tent and gave a good stretch to wake himself up. As he did, Shane came walking over, a towel wrapped around his neck.
"Morning, partner,"
Shane said as he got a little closer. Rick looked over at Shane and replied,
Hey, man, I thought you'd still be asleep. You kept watch most of the night, didn't you?
Shane pointed his thumb at the RV behind him and said,
"Glenn took over about halfway through, but I don't sleep much anyway. You want to take a shower? The one in Dale's camper still works. It's pond water, but it's better than nothing."
Rick rubbed his hand through his hair, feeling the dirt and grime that had built up over his trek to the camp, smiled, and replied,
Man, I'd love a shower. I'd kiss that luxury goodbye.
Shane smiled back at Rick and said,
"Don't linger too long. You and I are going hunting today."
Rick went into the camper and stepped into the shower. Even though it was quick, it felt good to feel clean once again. He got himself dressed and opened the bathroom door, a towel and his dirty pants in his hand. As he reached behind him to shut the door, he glimpsed a figure standing at the camper entrance.
Oh, hey!
Rick exclaimed, a surprised look on his face.
I didn't see you there, man. You almost scared me to death.
The man made his way over to Rick, who had a slight smile on his face.
So, you're Laurie's husband, huh?
Dale said as he got next to Rick.
Yeah,
Rick replied, the smile still on his face. Dale's expression changed to one of concern.
I don't want to stir nothing up, and you gotta understand this has nothing to do with your wife. She did nothing but talk about you while you were gone. She worried about you. She felt bad about leaving you. But that Shane, he's a good man. He helps out a lot around here. He took care of your wife, but he's not glad you're back. He's had his eye on Laurie for as long as I've known them.
Rick processed what Dale had to say, and a bigger smile came across his face as he placed his hand on Dale's shoulder.
Appreciate the advice, but Shane's my friend. We're just keeping her safe. I don't have anything to worry about.
Rick walked past Dale and opened the door to leave the camper when Dale called out to him, pointed at himself with his thumb in a fisted hand, and said,
I wouldn't trust him around my wife.
As Rick opened the door, he gave a quick glance back at Dale and replied,
I'll keep that in mind.
Rick walked out of the camper, still holding onto the pants and towel, and looked over at his tent. Laurie stood holding a cardboard box of dirty clothing and laughing. Shane stood next to her holding 2 shotguns across his shoulder, laughing as well. Rick raised an eyebrow as a smirk came to his lips.
Crazy old man,
he said to himself and started to walk towards them.
You ready?
Shane asked Rick as he approached the two. Should get going if we're going to find anything.
I'm ready when you are,
Rick replied. Laurie made her way over to her husband and said,
I'll take those, hun.
Rick gave a big smile and placed his pants and towel into the box of laundry.
Scrub 'em really good. They're a bit funky.
Laurie chuckled and replied to Rick,
Uh-huh. Don't you have some animals to try and shoot?
Rick chuckled back and said,
That's the plan. Love you.
While Shane handed him a rifle. As Shane led the way to the hunting grounds, Rick placed his hat upon his head while Laurie stood and watched the two leave.
I love you too. Be careful.
Laurie started to make her way to the stream when her son ran by quickly, holding a small sand pail.
Carl,
she called out to the young boy who stopped dead in his tracks.
Where are you going?
Carl looked up at his mother, a great big grin on his face, and pointed in the direction of the station wagon.
Over by Sophia's car. We're going to play in the dirt.
Laurie leaned down to look Carl in the eyes and put her hand just under his chin to lift his head up.
All right. I'm going to go wash our clothes with Donna and Carol. You make sure you and Sophia keep an eye on Alan. If he tells you to get in the RV, you do it.
Carl politely responded,
Okay, Mama.
As Carl made his way towards the car and Sophia, Donna and Carol came walking towards Laurie carrying their own laundry.
Don't worry. Amy and Andrea are going to watch the kids,
Donna said as Amy, Andrea, and the twin boys walked behind them. Carol added jokingly,
Anything to get out of laundry duty.
With a big smile on her face, Amy called back to Carol,
You damn right.
Not in front of the kids,
Donna scolded Amy, a scornful look on her face. Amy replied,
Oh, bite me.
As Andrea laughed out loud. As the three women made their way down to the stream, Amy called out after them,
Stay safe.
Laurie, carrying a box against her leg with one hand, looked back at the two sisters and replied,
Always.
The three women made their way through a small opening between the trees, making conversation along the way.
I can't wait to see how these things smell with the new detergent Glenn got from the city,
Carol said, looking over at the other two women.
That stuff Dale had in the RV just wasn't working. Made the clothes smell better, but not by much,
Laurie replied as she looked back at Carol.
Jesus Christ, will you two listen to yourselves?
Donna exclaimed, annoyed.
You're excited about trying out a new detergent. This is such bullshit.
Surprised, Laurie looked over at Donna.
Damn, Donna, we're not throwing a party. I'm just looking forward to the possibility of clean-smelling clothes. That'd be a welcome change at this point.
Donna just looked at Laurie and started to get angrier.
I just don't understand why we're the ones doing laundry while they go off and hunt. When things get back to normal, I wonder if we'll still be allowed to vote.
Are you serious?
Laurie said, again shocked by what Donna had to say.
I don't know about you, but I can't shoot a gun. I've never even tried. To be honest, I wouldn't trust any of those guys to wash my clothes. Rick couldn't do it with a washing machine. He'd be lost out here.
Carol, who was keeping to herself the entire time Laurie and Donna argued, smiled hearing Laurie. As they reached the stream, Laurie continued,
This isn't about women's rights. It's about being realistic and doing what needs to be done.
Donna just huffed and said,
Whatever.
Back up at the camp, Amy and Andrea hung out against the station wagon, while the twins played with a small toy close to the front of the car. Carl and Sophia were on the side of the car, playing in a small patch of dirt. Sophia was scooping up piles of dirt and trying to form a small sandcastle with it.
You think my daddy will come back too?
She asked Carl as she paused a moment to look over at him. Carl continued digging dirt into his small sand pail and casually replied, "Ain't your daddy dead?" A distressed look came over Sophia as she said, "Yeah, but so was your daddy, and he came back." Carl stopped what he was doing for a second and looked at Sophia. "My daddy was just sick. We had to leave him in the hospital back home so he could get better. He wasn't dead," he coolly explained and returned to digging. Sophia, now even more saddened by what Carl had to say to her, looked down at her small dirt pile and continued forming it. "Oh," she said softly, "I miss my daddy." Rick and Shane made their way through the woods searching for any animal that dared cross their path.
I thought I'd take Lori and Carl down here to her parents and come back, Shane explained, walking several feet behind Rick. I thought this thing would be over in a week. I didn't want to explain stolen guns to the captain when I got back.
Rick continued on eagle-eyed, hoping to spot an animal to bring back to the group. "Well, if you'd seen the place the way I did, you wouldn't have been so worried about the rules. I don't think it'll ever be the same again."
Shane looked over at Rick and replied, "Don't say that, man. This won't last."
Rick stopped for a moment and looked back at Shane. "I don't know, man. It looked bad."
"Well, I'm glad you brought these guns," Shane said as he surveyed the area. "We just had Dale's rifle and my sidearm. Someone had to keep watch with the rifle at all times, and it's hard as hell to hunt with a pistol. Just about all we've had to eat was canned goods Glenn brought back from the city."
Rick cocked his head to the side to look at Shane. "Man, what's up with that guy? Risking his life every day to get toilet paper and candy bars? I mean, it's a great help, and it did save my life, but damn."
"I have no idea. He seems to know how to get in and out before they gang up on him. It's—"
Shane was suddenly interrupted by the rustle of some leaves behind the tree just up ahead of them. He put his finger to his lips, letting Rick know he should be quiet. As the two men made their way around the tree, a horrific sight came into view. Sitting up against the tree was one of the creatures, wearing glasses, a collared shirt and tie, no doubt a businessman of some sort, and gorging itself on the neck of a deer. Rick and Shane stopped, shocked, expecting to bag an animal. The creature kept on consuming the deer, uninterested in the two men who stood mere feet away. "Doesn't even know we're here," Rick whispered to Shane, who stood intently studying the creature.
"Do you think we should get the deer away from it?"
Shane asked. Rick replied, concerned. "Do you think it would be safe to eat?" Lori, Donna, and Carol were finishing up their laundry down by the river. As Lori and Donna sat on the bank of the stream scrubbing the last of their dirty clothing, Carol watched over her shoulder, looking back in the direction of the camp. "You don't have to constantly keep watch," Lori said, looking over at Carol. "They're not that fast. A glance in all directions every 5 minutes will do it." Carol kept looking and replied, "I'm just being thorough." Donna was on her knees, a scrub brush in her hand, intently cleaning.
So, entertain us, Lori. How'd you meet Rick?
Lori, who was rinsing off a jacket in the stream, looked over at Donna. "I think this job is mundane enough without me putting you both to sleep."
Come on, I could use a good nap.
Donna replied, still scrubbing. Lori pulled the jacket out of the stream and gave it a twist to wring out the water. "All right, but I warned you," she said. "Rick's brother Jeff is my age. I'm 2 years younger than Rick. I met his brother senior year of high school." Upon hearing this, Donna's face lit up in a smile.
It started with the brother? I'm all ears.
Carol made her way back to the two women as well, her curiosity raised. "It's nothing like that. We were friends," Lori explained as she put the damp jacket back in the box with the rest of the clean clothing. "Jeff invited me to a New Year's party. Apparently Rick had been made chaperone by their parents who were attending a party elsewhere. I met Rick there. He was going to college for police administration. Everything about him was interesting." Donna, still listening intently, started gathering her things as Lori looked at her and smiled. "You know what it's like that time of the year when you're alone. I hung on every word. Everything about him was perfect, and at midnight I had someone to kiss. We really hit it off. We kept in touch while he finished college, and I attempted to last more than a year at mine. I didn't. After college was out of the way, I moved back home, and that's when Rick and I got really serious. The rest is pretty self-explanatory. See? Pretty dull." Lori put the rest of her clothes into the box, and the three women got ready to head back. "I gotta say, you two look good together," Carol remarked. "Rick and I are the most compatible people on earth," Lori replied as she stood up. "We are perfect for each other."
Come on, let's get back to camp.
Donna said as the three women gathered their things and headed for home. As they walked along past a small tree, a creature sat up and looked in their direction. It had been hidden by the brush and heard the women as they walked by. The creature groaned as it made its way from behind the tree to follow the women. Laurie, Donna, and Carol continued walking, unaware that a monster was closing in on them slowly but surely. Atop the camper, Alan sat watching the women when he noticed the creature behind them. He started waving his hand and screamed, "Look out!" The three women turned to see the creature on top of them. Carol took off to the left, and Laurie, dropping her box, took off to the right. Donna stood stunned at the creature, who was mere feet away. "Move, Donna!" Alan screamed as he took aim with the rifle. Donna, still stunned, didn't hear him as the creature raised its arms to grab her. "Damn it, move!" Alan yelled out, hoping she would get out of the way. Without warning, an axe went through the neck of the creature, sending its head flying, spraying blood everywhere. Dale had heard the commotion and came running just in time to save Donna. Out of breath, he stood there leaning against the axe, one hand on his hip. Tears streamed down Donna's face as she fell to her knees. She knew she was inches from death and was overcome with shock and grief.
I couldn't. You saved my life.
Dale, still trying to get breath into his lungs, looked over at Donna and replied,
Don't mention it.
All the occupants of the camp came running in their direction now to make sure that everything was all right. Alan bolted by Carol, trying to get to his wife. Right behind him ran Sophia and Carl.
Mom!
Carl screamed, a look of terror on his face. Alan grabbed Donna tight and hugged her while the group huddled together in shock.
I was chopping firewood when I heard the screams and
Dale started to say when he heard a moan from behind. The head of the creature grunted out, unable to move. Alan and Donna looked down terrified at the head as it just lay there groaning. The group stood and watched as Dale's jaw dropped open.
It's still alive!
Donna screamed out as Alan grabbed her tighter. Shane and Rick stood looking at the creature still devouring the deer and thought about their options.
I don't even want to think about the diseases these things must carry. I'm not eating any of that deer, and neither is my family,
Rick said.
Yeah, I think you're right,
Shane replied. He looked at Rick and asked,
You ever seen one up close like this?
A couple times, but not for this long without it attacking me,
Rick said as he turned to Shane. The creature growled as it looked up at the two men standing near, a handful of bloody deer meat still in its hand.
That's not good,
Rick remarked as he and Shane took a step back. The creature, now fully aware of Rick and Shane, started to get up from its seated position when Rick brought the axe down on its head, knocking the glasses from its face. As the creature fell to the ground lifeless, Rick grabbed a rag from his pocket and wiped off the axe head.
I wasn't going to wait for him to come after us.
Off in the distance, a gunshot echoed through the air. "The camp!" Shane yelled as he and Rick turned their attention towards the sound. As fast as they could, Rick and Shane came running into the camp where the group stood around talking and holding each other. Alan was opening the bolt on the rifle to eject the spent cartridge he had just fired.
Laurie!
Rick screamed out as he dropped his shotgun and ran into Laurie's arms. Laurie grabbed onto him tightly.
You and Carl okay? What happened?
Laurie looked up from her embrace and replied,
It came out of the woods, tried to kill us. It almost got Donna, but Dale cut its head off, and it was still alive. They had to shoot it. Oh, God, Rick, it was awful.
Let's get this thing into the woods and out of the way,
Alan said as Rick and Laurie still held each other and the group started to disperse. Alan and Dale grabbed hold of the legs of the body of the creature and started to drag it off to get it away from the camp.
Everything's okay now, hun,
Rick said to Laurie, who just stared up into his eyes as they continued to hold tight to each other. Behind them, Shane stood, watching the two intently as his face changed to one of jealousy. This podcast is not endorsed by Skybound, Image Comics, or Robert Kirkman. It is intended for entertainment purposes only. The Walking Dead, all characters, names of characters, or other Walking Dead related items are registered trademarks and or copyrights of Skybound LLC and their respective trademark and copyright holders. The official Walking Dead site can be found at www.thewalkingdead.com. Songs: The Descent, Steel and Seething, and Undaunted by Kevin MacLeod. Opening theme by Gene Grasso. All original content of this podcast is the intellectual property of Eugene Grasso unless otherwise indicated.